Here are the most terrifying murders of some of the most notorious serial killers in history. Jeffrey Dahmer. On May 27, 1991, Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, one of America's most notorious serial killers, committed one of his most depraved and heartbreaking crimes against Conorak Synthesomphone, a 14-year-old Laotian boy. Conorak was wandering near the Grand Avenue Mall in Milwaukee when Dahmer spotted him. Using his usual tactics of charm and false promises, Dahmer approached the boy, offering him money in exchange for coming back to his apartment to pose for photographs. Conorak, vulnerable and trusting, agreed. Once inside Dahmer's apartment, Conorak was given a drink laced with powerful sedatives, likely halcyon or another barbiturate used to incapacitate his victims. As the drugs took effect, Dahmer stripped the boy and began his sadistic rituals. Dahmer drilled a hole into Conorak's skull while he was still alive, a method he referred to as his zombie-making process. He injected hydrochloric acid and boiling water into the brain cavity in an attempt to create a submissive, living sex slave. Conorak, barely conscious, was in unimaginable agony as the corrosive liquid seared through his brain tissue. Dahmer then sexually assaulted the barely responsive boy, violating him repeatedly as he lay helpless. The torture continued for hours, with Dahmer alternating between assault, further drugging, and experimenting on Conorak's deteriorating body. At some point, Dahmer left the apartment to buy more alcohol and supplies, and Conorak, despite his catastrophic injuries, managed to stumble out of the apartment, naked, bleeding from his head, and in a drugged haze. Two young women, Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress, spotted him on the street, clearly disoriented and in distress. They approached him, but he could only mumble incoherently. When Dahmer returned and saw the crowd forming around Conorak, he smoothly lied to the gathering bystanders, claiming Conorak was his 19-year-old lover who had gotten too drunk during a consensual encounter. The police arrived, but despite the women's pleas that something was terribly wrong, they accepted Dahmer's story. Tragically, they did not check Dahmer's identification or properly question Conorak, who was in no state to defend himself. They even laughed with Dahmer as he led the boy back into his apartment. One officer later infamously radioed in, describing the situation as an intoxicated lover's quarrel. Once back inside, Dahmer knew he had to act quickly. Conorak was too damaged to survive much longer. Dahmer strangled him to death, then dismembered his body with meticulous precision. He kept Conorak's skull as a trophy and preserved it with chemicals, later posing it for photos alongside the remains of his other victims. The boy's flesh was dissolved in acid, and his bones were stored in Dahmer's macabre collection. By the time police finally raided Dahmer's apartment months later, Conorak's remains were among the 11 confirmed victims found in various states of decomposition. It was later discovered that Conorak was the younger brother of one of Dahmer's previous victims, 14-year-old Synthesomphone, whom Dahmer had sexually assaulted in 1988. Conorak's murder became one of the most infamous examples of police negligence in American history. The two officers involved were fired, though later reinstated, and the case sparked outrage over racial bias. Had Conorak been a white child, would the police have acted differently? Dahmer, of course, continued killing until his arrest in July 1991. He later confessed to murdering 17 boys and young men, many of whom suffered similar horrors. What do you think about this case? Do you think the police dismissed the accusations of the two women because of racial bias? Probably because they were black or Conorak was Asian. Let me know in the comments what you think. Ted Bundy. On the night of January 15, 1978, in the Chi Omega sorority house, Bundy had already bludgeoned and strangled Lisa Levy in another room before turning his attention to Margaret Bowman, a 21-year-old Florida State University student who was asleep in her bed. He struck her in the head with a heavy oak log, crushing her skull with such force that brain matter splattered across the walls. After killing her, Bundy used Levy's nail polish, smearing it around Bowman's body in a grotesque parody of makeup. Then, in a final act of defilement, he bit down hard into one of her buttocks, leaving deep, distinct teeth marks, a signature Bundy would later replicate on other victims. When police arrived, they found Bowman's lifeless body in a state of horrific violation. The bite mark would later become crucial evidence, as dental impressions matched Bundy's jagged, misaligned teeth. H. Holmes. In 1893, Julia Smythe Connors, a striking brunette in her late 20s, was working as a stenographer in Holmes's fraudulent drugstore in Chicago. Recently, she had separated from her husband, Ned Connors, and Julia was vulnerable, struggling to support herself and her 8-year-old daughter, Pearl. Holmes recognized her desperation and swooped in with false charm. He offered Julia financial stability, a place to stay, and the promise of security. By April 1893, she and Pearl had moved into Holmes's castle, which was later referred to as his Murder Castle, a three-story building disguised as a hotel but secretly rigged with soundproof rooms, gas chambers, and chutes leading to a basement furnace. Holmes had no intention of keeping Julia or Pearl alive. He saw them as disposable obstacles in his path. Julia, perhaps sensing something amiss, had begun to question Holmes's shady business dealings. Worse, she discovered his bigamy. He was already married to Myrta Belknap while courting Julia under the alias Henry Gordon. On April 1893, Holmes lured Julia into one of the castle's soundproof rooms under the pretense of discussing finances. Once inside, he sealed the door and released toxic gases from hidden pipes, suffocating her slowly as she clawed at the walls. Pearl was next, and Holmes had no use for her. Whether she witnessed her mother's murder or was killed separately is unknown, but her fate was just as grim. Some speculate she was drugged and her body disposed of via the building's secret chute, where she either suffocated in the fumes or was incinerated in the basement furnace. Andrei Chikatilo. On September 8, 1990, Chikatilo encountered Lyudmila Alexeyeva, a 17-year-old girl who had traveled to Rostov to purchase textbooks for her upcoming studies. Chikatilo saw her at the central bus station, asking for directions with her arms full of newly purchased books. He approached her under the pretense of helping her navigate the bus schedule. Then Chikatilo lured her to a secluded wooded area with promises of a shortcut to her bus, where he stabbed her over 50 times in a frenzied attack. He gouged out her eyes, believing an old superstition that his victim's eyes would retain his image, and removed several organs including her uterus, which he partially consumed at the scene. Her body was discovered by mushroom foragers 2 weeks later, identifiable only by the distinctive handmade sweater her mother had knitted for her university studies and the medical textbooks scattered around the clearing. When news of her death reached her village, her mother collapsed and never fully recovered, dying less than a year later from what locals called grief sickness. Albert Fish. Albert Howard Fish, a 64-year-old serial killer, child rapist, and cannibal, had been stalking potential victims in New York City. Posing as a harmless old man, he went by the alias Frank Howard to avoid suspicion. On May 25, 1928, Fish visited the Budd family's apartment in Manhattan under the pretense of hiring their eldest son, Edward Budd, for a farm job. Fish charmed Grace's parents, Albert and Delia Budd, with his grandfatherly demeanor, even bringing strawberries as a gift to gain their trust. On June 3, 1928, Fish returned to the Budds' home, this time with a different plan. He claimed he was attending the birthday party of his niece and asked if Grace, their 10-year-old daughter, could join him to deliver cake and ice cream. The Budds, still believing him to be a kind old man, were hesitant at first but later agreed. Grace dressed in a pink gingham dress and left happily with Fish, waving goodbye to her family. They took the subway to the 135th Street station, then boarded a train to Westchester County. Grace, unaware of Fish's true nature, chatted excitedly about the party. Fish then lured Grace to an isolated, decaying house in Wisteria Cottage, near Irvington, New York, under the pretense of collecting flowers for the party. Once inside, he stripped her, tied her up, and gagged her. Grace, terrified, cried for her mother, but Fish showed no mercy. He sexually assaulted her, then strangled her to death. The Budd family, devastated by Grace's disappearance, searched desperately for 6 years. Fish sent them taunting letters over the years, but it wasn't until November 11, 1934, that he made a fatal mistake. He mailed a chilling, handwritten letter to Delia Budd, detailing Grace's murder in explicit, sadistic detail. Fish described how he butchered Grace's body, consuming parts of her flesh in a stew with carrots, onions, and strips of bacon. He preserved some of her remains in a trunk, later disposing of them in the woods. The letter was traced back to Fish through a laundry mark, leading to his arrest on December 13, 1934. Albert Fish was later executed by the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison. His last words were reportedly, "I don't even know why I'm here." If you like the channel and would love to support, please drop a like and subscribe, because you know why you're here.